In this third video, we'll be adding a nav mesh agent to the AI, as well as an FSM to allow the AI to determine whether the player is nearby and if the player is visible. The last bit that we need to add to our scene is an FSM that can control the movement of our enemy. But before we do that, we need to add a second FSM to our player object. So select your player object in the hierarchy. In the inspector, hit Add Component, and we want to add an FSM. I'm going to name that FSM Set Player Object, and then press Edit to bring it up in the editor window. This FSM needs to do one thing. It needs to save the player game object as a global variable, so that'll be accessible to all the enemies in the scene. So first off, let's create that variable. Go to Variables, Global Variables. We need to set its type to game object. And then we're going to name it player object and press Add. We can close that window and go back to our state. Now we need one action in here, and that's a find game object. So if we click on Action Browser, type in find, and hit Enter or double click, you can add the find game object action. Now you can search by name or you can search by tag, and it's going to return the first object that it finds. Since we only have one object with the player tag, we don't need to put a name in, and we can simply search by tag. So select the tag of player, and we need to choose where to store it. We're going to store that under our global variable that we just created, player object. And that's it. Now let's move on to the FSM that'll go on the enemy. This one's a little bit more complex. So select your enemy game object, go to your inspector, and we're going to add two things to this. First, we're going to add a nav mesh agent, just like we did to the player. So add the nav mesh agent, and then we're going to add an FSM. And again, I'm leaving that nav mesh agent, I'm leaving all the settings to the default. We might come back and adjust that a little bit to make it easier to test, but for now we're going to leave that as is. I'm going to rename our FSM AI Movement and press Enter or press Edit to bring it into the edit window. This FSM is going to need 3 states. So I'm going to add 2 new states. And I'm going to rename these. Call this state Set Destination. And this state is going to do exactly what it says. It's going to set the destination for the nav mesh agent. The first state is going to check values. And this is going to check some Boolean values to see if the player is nearby and if the player can be seen. The last state is going to update those values. It's going to go out to the radar and the detect FSM and get updates on these values. So we need to create 2 variables to store the Boolean values of whether we can see the player and whether the player is nearby. Change the type to Boolean. Name the first one is near and add that. Second one, can see. And the reason we're using local variables is we want this specific enemy to determine whether it can see the player or if the player is near. If we use global, then all the enemies would think they could see the player, or all the enemies would think the player can be seen. So let's work on this update values state first. So go to the state and action browser, and we're gonna use the command get FSM bool. Get FSM bool. Double click on that one. And what we're going to need to do, we need to select the game object where this FSM is on. So we need to specify the game object. And we're going to drag the radar object down into the field. Then we need to choose the FSM. Click the little dots. Choose radar. And we need to choose the variable name, can see player. And then we're going to store that value on the local variable can see. And then we need to do that again for is the player near. So add that action yet again. Specify game object, and this time we're dragging the detect object down. Choose the FSM, detect. Choose the variable name, player is near. And we're going to store that value is near. We don't need to do that every frame because we're going to loop through this. Now, when we're looping through in Playmaker, you can get an error because it loops through too many times. And by default, it'll give you an error after it loops through 1,000 times. So we're going to use a command called next frame, or an action called next frame. So search for next frame. We're going to add this in. And we're going to set this to the bottom. Okay. And it's going to send this event after it waits 1 frame, which will prevent any sort of looping errors. Okay, so there's that. We'll come back and set up transitions in a minute. Let's go to the set destination. Let's go to the check values. Check values. Here we're going to have to check whether those booleans are true or not. So go to your action browser, and we're going to search for bool test. Not bool test. We want bool all true. Double click on that. And it's going to ask us how many boolean variables do we want to check. We want to check 2. Type in 2, press enter. And then we're going to use our local variables, can see, and is near. It's going to check and see if all of those are true. If all of those are true, we'll be able to call an event. All right, let's work on our set. Let's look at our set destination. Actually, let's go back to our check values here, and let's add in that same next frame. It's a good thing to add in there. Go to our set destination, and here we need to set the navigation agent's destination. So first thing we need to do is get the position of the player. So in the action browser, we're going to search for get position, add that to our state, and we need to choose the game object that we're trying to get the position of. We're going to specify the game object. We're going to hit the equals so we can select a variable. And then we're going to go down under the globals and get our player object that we created earlier. Now we need to store that position as a vector. So let's go to variables and create a new vector variable. It's going to be type vector3. I'm going to call it player position. I'm going to add that. Go back to my state. Save that as player position. Now we need to actually tell the nav mesh agent where to go. So in your inspector, while you've selected your enemy object, grab the nav mesh agent and drop it into your state. And we're going to set property. The property we want to set is the destination. So click on property, go up to destination, and we want to choose vector3. Now we can type in a value, but that's not very useful. So let's hit the equal sign so we can choose a variable. And we're going to choose that newly created vector3 called player position. We don't need to do that every frame, we just need to do it once. And again here, because we're looping, we're going to add in the next frame event. Make sure that's at the bottom. And there we go. Now let's look at setting up our events or our transitions. When we check our values, we're going to need 2 transitions. One, if it's all true, another if it's not true. If they're true, we're going to move to set destination and move our player. If they're not true, we're going to go back and update our values and look at it again. So we're going to create one event, values true, and another, values false. So let's add those in. Add transition, values false, values true. So again, if those values are true, we're going to go to set destination. If they're false, we're going to come down here and try to update our values again. If we do go to the set destination, we're going to need a transition that brings us back. So we're going to say player moved. We're going to add that to our set destination. And once we move the player, we're going to go back and check our values again. Well, actually, we're going to go to update values. After we've moved, we want to check and see, hey, are our values still true? After we update our values, we simply need to go back up and check those values. So we're going to add one last event, values updated. And that's going to connect up here to check values. So let's set up those events. Go to the check values. Send event if this is all true. So if all true, we're going to go to values true. If not, we're going to come down here and we're going to go to values false. Under update values, we're just updating our values. And so when we're done with all that, we're going to send the event values updated. Over in the set destination, we get our position, we set the destination, we wait a frame, and then we call player moved. So that should be it. Let's check it out, see if it all works. So you can see our FSM going back and forth between checking values and updating values. Now if I get closer, both of them become true and my AI starts to follow. Let's do one more test here. It's pretty hard to tell whether the enemy AI is actually checking to see whether it can see us. So let's slow down the AI a little bit. Make sure you've selected your enemy, go to the inspector, and open up the nav mesh agent. And we're going to set its speed quite a bit lower, maybe just 1 for now. That'll allow our player to run away. Let's see what happens. So my player comes close, and now he should be able to hide behind the wall. He can now get away. Player's no longer nearby. If I get close to the player, or close to the enemy, they can't see me, so they're not going to chase me. As soon as I come around the corner, they're going to come chase. And that's all there is to it. Your AI can now chase your player